You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, everyone, we are back, still in the book of Judges, still chapter 5, still with Deborah. This is coming up on, week 4 with Deborah?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have quite a bit to say about her, and hopefully it's not all the same as, like, stuff you've already heard.
I think we're going to branch out.
Oh, yeah, no, I say that not to say, like, us getting repetitive, but I think as opposed to, like, a lot of the arguments surrounding her.
Oh, yeah.
So,
well, and because there's just, again, like we've said before, there just isn't a lot of work done with the actual text. And that's what I'm focusing on. What does the Bible present to us in this song? Because it's theologically dense and there's just so much. I stopped myself from going down so many side trails. This song just connects and interconnects and reconnects all these different passages in the Bible.
mm-hmm.
And you really begin to get this sense of it being a matrix, and that there is a divine plan. There is purpose behind it, and that God is accomplishing his purposes through people and sometimes in spite of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so a lot of the ideas here we can trace literally from Genesis through Revelation.
Yeah,
and
we talked briefly about some of this, but we didn't go in depth off mic, so I'm excited. So
yeah.
Anyone else who's hearing a lot of this stuff for the first time, I'm hearing a lot of this stuff for the first time. So I'm going to try to keep this conversational, and by the grace of God, I might have something pertinent to the conversation.
Oh, I know you will, and so we're going to the next few verses we're going to kind of just zip through real quick, because yes, there's some interesting things in there, but I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on them. We're picking up in verses 6 through 8, and so Deborah right here, she says that in the days of Shamgar. So we know who Shamgar is because he was at the end of chapter 3, and in the days of Jael. Now, in the earlier, just the past episode, we mentioned that McDaniel had suggested that some of the narrative pieces were in the poem, and some of the poem pieces were in the narrative, and so there had been some mix-up. This is one of those places he thinks is mixed up, that verse regarding Shamgar should actually be here. And so it would form a more complete couplet, and that it shouldn't have been placed in that previous chapter, and it would make more sense. I don't know if I agree with that. It kind of, the verse in chapter 3 it was weird. It didn't seem to fit, but for whatever reason, it was preserved. We do have the information in it. What's interesting about this is Deborah does not name this era after herself. This is not the days of Deborah. It's not the days of Gideon. It's not the days of Samson. It's Shamgar.
The days of Shamgar.
Yeah.
That seems like a really, it seems like a sci-fi fantasy fiction,
right?
Like series, The Days of Shamgar.
I could see this
trilogy.
I could see Shamgar being like an alien on Star Trek so easily.
Yeah, I could see that too. I was thinking more like a Conan type thing.
Right.
Shamgar.
Well, let's see. Well, what Conan was he supposed to be Akkadian?
No, he's barbarian.
Barbarian.
So he would have been north.
I haven't actually seen the movies.
Well,
so.
You don't have to. Well, I don't think that's actually. I think he's actually in some kind of mystical realm in the movies, but the fact that his name is Conan
the Barbarian. Right. Okay.
That's where I am with that.
Well.
But I think I may have seen part of the movie as it aired in like a Fox Sunday afternoon special.
And you kids turn that off.
Yeah. so there's a peek into our childhood. Go ahead.
Anyway, but it's interesting that she names this era after Shamgar and Jael, because they're not Hebrew. They're outsiders. And the fact that she's acknowledging that it's outsiders that God's using to not only discipline the nation, but also to deliver the nation. So just right there, verse 6b, we have this reference to the fact that the highways are being so overrun with thieves and invaders that they're scared to go on these journeys, and they're having to use the back roads and the secret mountain paths kind of idea, that there's an economic hardship going on here.
Yeah, crime is so prevalent that
right.
basically the criminals are running everything.
Exactly. And so she's setting that scene for you. And so when we get to verse 7b now, we're going to slow it down again. It says, until I arose, I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. No.
It's interesting. In the JPS, it says until you arose.
Okay. At that point, this is one of those points of debate. Is Deborah singing here, or is Barak singing here?
So if they were singing together and it was a duet with male and female parts.
We have a duet going on here, and we have also a responsive chorus going on here. So we have actually 3 voices. Where those voices come in and where they break apart, it's kind of in debate. Different traditions have it different places. So there's not a lot of consensus.
Yeah, well, and it's also interesting. In the ESV, it says villages ceased. In the JPS, it says deliverance ceased. So I mean, again,
I don't have any notes on that particular one.
That's kind of bizarre and interesting.
Yeah,
but anyway, let's move on.
So yeah, I don't have any notes on it, but the main point's still intact. So you can see, despite the fact there are differences in the translation, we still have the main theme is there. And so, but notice she arose as a mother in Israel, not the mother of Israel. Rebecca is usually considered to be the mother of Israel.
Right.
So I think it's kind of interesting that it is Rebecca. There's no mention of Deborah having children. So the idea being that in her role as a prophetess, as a Naviah, that she mothers Israel through these proclamations and in her guidance and leadership. There is another book, and I'm not going to go into the connection here. I'm just going to throw it out. It's in the Apocrypha, the book of Judith. It picks up on these same themes, and I'll put a link in the show notes, a PDF that you can read it online if you don't have it. Since it is in the Apocrypha, it's as Protestants, we don't consider it part of the canon, but it still is a very influential and useful book for understanding how language was used. But it builds on this theme of Deborah and Jael beautifully. It's one of my favorite stories, and I'll leave it there because I don't want to get too far off track. So, but she's also connecting this to a future event, and it's in 2 Samuel 20:14 through 22. Joab is hunting down this guy named Sheba. Joab was one of David's generals. He's going after this guy named Sheba. Sheba takes refuge in a city called Abel Beth Makkah. And as he's attacking the city, this wise woman comes out and she stops him and she says, are you going to destroy the city that's a mother of Israel?
Okay.
And she says, quit, just stop. We'll handle it. And so she goes back into the city, and the people of the city capture this guy, put his head in a sack, and toss it over the city wall to Joab. And so I was like, when I read that, I'm going, wait a minute. But the point is that phrase connects her to a wise woman. Being a prophet, that's one of the primary characteristics that you would have wisdom. And so the idea that in Israel, it wasn't just Deborah who had this special position of being consulted and being looked at as a source of knowledge and wisdom. There's actually a tradition of many women who may not be named, they might not be identified, but they were there.
Yeah, but it wasn't rare, it wasn't unheard of.
Right, because the other thing, in this particular passage, and even in chapter 4, I brought this up in one of the previous episodes, but we should remember, if it had been something so completely wild and unique, the text would have pointed it out.
Right.
And it doesn't. It's just assumed. Now, Deborah's doing this with a purpose. And when we look at prophetic writings, we have to remember there is purpose in what's being said. She's doing several different things by using this phrase. One of them, she's causing the reader or the listener to get ready for a comparison, because at the end of the song, which we aren't going to go into now, but at the end of the song, she's going to reference Sisera's mother.
Okay.
So she's setting herself up as the character to compare and contrast Sisera's mother with. And when we get into Sisera's mother, we find that there are so many different distinctions between the two and how they viewed this event, not just as being enemies, but really in their personality.
Okay.
And so she's also setting up the reader to compare Jael with Rachel and Rebecca. And so that's going to be, we're going to bring that out again more, but there's a lot of foreshadowing here. So I want to point it out as we come to it, so that when we get there, you're going to be prepared for it and you're going to see it. And that's what Deborah's setting up here. She wants you to get the theme, and she wants you to get the scene, and she wants it to all be at play in your mind as she moves forward.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm really curious that she says in the days of Jael, because you really think, well, what status did she have?
Right.
Because she had to be of status other than just the person who killed Sisera.
Well, or was she, or did she gain that status because she killed Sisera?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there would be some of that.
We already talked about how she was very informed. She knew who Sisera was. Pretty certain she knew who Barak was. Who is Heber? What position does he play? This is all the stuff that.
Yeah, and then it's very. I don't know. I was throw that out there. It just seems weird to me.
Well, and I think this shows us where a lot of the record keeping was done by men. And so we don't have the women front and center a lot of times, and we don't have a lot of details. But at the same time, a lot of times, even with the men, we don't have a lot of that background information.
Sure.
So we have a lot of speculation, but I think it really shows the economy of language in the Bible. And so now moving into verse 8, and I know this is going to be where you talked about jumping in.
This is where it got me when I was reading through this. And I was like, when they chose new gods, was there a fighter then in the gates? No shield nor spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. So there, when what were chosen? When they chose new gods. I think ESV says when new gods were chosen.
Right.
When new gods were chosen, then the war was in the gates. Was shield or spear seen among the 40,000 in Israel? So yeah, that line kind of makes your brain wonder.
Sets off all the bells and whistles. Well, okay, so the first thing it does, it reminds us why there's a war. There's a war because the people chose new gods. The purpose of the war is not just because there was some group of people who didn't like them. This is the result of God's discipline. But the second thing it does, it indicates there's an ability to choose. And, I don't think you can get much clearer on that. And this phrase, new gods, it takes us back to, remember, you're supposed to read Judges with Joshua in mind. So it takes us back to Joshua 24, verse 14 and 15. I don't have this one written out, but everyone is very familiar with it because we like to shorten it and turn it into a nice little wall hanging.
24 what?
24, 14, and 15.
Now therefore revere the Lord and serve him with undivided loyalty. Put away the gods that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Or, if you are loath to serve the Lord, choose this day which ones you are going to serve, the gods of that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates, or those of the Amorites in whose land you are settled. But I and my house will serve the Lord.
So that aspect of choice. God's laying it out. He's saying you have the ability to decide which God you will choose. then we also have to remember not only is Joshua important to the writing of Judges, Deuteronomy is central to the writing of Judges. And so if you look at Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 20, and I'm not going to read all of that, but it's outlining the choice between life and death and blessing and cursing. Go back to Deuteronomy 28. It lays out what blessings will entail. It lays out what curses will entail, all based on who do you choose? Which God are you going to choose to serve? Deuteronomy 11, 26 through 32. There's a blessing for serving God and not going after new gods. All of this is brought to the forefront here with Deborah's song. And it reminds us that in Deuteronomy, one of the central themes is choice. And that's repeated over and over again. And it's the burden and the honor of the people to be able to choose. And what are they choosing? They're choosing which God they're going to serve. I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is Deuteronomy is the third most quoted book of the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Okay.
It's quoted 44 times. The only other books that are quoted more are Psalms and Isaiah. And if you look at Isaiah, well, and if you look at Isaiah, again, we have this theme of choosing. Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 10 times. So when we read the New Testament, we need to be keeping Deuteronomy in mind because the writers of the New Testament expected their readers to either know Deuteronomy or they expected them to start studying Deuteronomy. And so this should inform our understanding. But we have to ask, why is there a choice? You know, if they could choose to serve new gods, why is there a warning against it? Why is this so prevalent if there's not the ability to choose?
Right.
And so now we get into, the other theme of Deuteronomy, which is they're an elect nation.
Yeah.
So Deuteronomy 7, chapter 7, verses 6 and 7. For you are a people holy, which means set apart or elect, to the Lord your God, the Lord your God, who has chosen you to be a people as his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So God's saying, I chose you, but in the next breath, he's saying, you can choose me or you can reject me. And
so this is where we're going to get into, this is where we're going to lose friends. No, I'm kidding. This is where we get into the idea of election and salvation are not necessarily synonymous.
Precisely.
And especially if you look at it the way that God's, he says, I've elected you. I'm here to share my words with you, to share with you the path to to life, the path to death, and you get to choose which one. And so the election there is, and I think, Heiser talks about this in his baptism series.
I believe so.
Where he talks about election and salvation are two different things, where the election of Israel is you're elected into a people who have access to the oracles of God, but you get to choose what you're going to do with them. Because you do see people, of Israel who apostatize. Yes. Sorry, I know I had the first part of that word, who apostatize and then fall away. So were they not actually elect, but God said the whole nation's elect? So if you really look at how that works, another example I like of this is, we talked earlier about using people in spite of themselves. God talks about, and I don't have the whole verse. Cyrus talks about using Cyrus as the person who's going to deliver Israel, and everyone will say, well, that means that God chose Cyrus for, he elected him before he was ever born, and that's true. But he didn't say anything about whether or not there was eternal salvation involved in that. He said he was going to use him to deliver his people. And he also elects leaders around the world to discipline Israel, and kings that he calls evil in his own book. Doesn't say anything about their salvation. So, we have plenty of examples where election and salvation and eternal salvation, two totally different topics. And again, we're not making any friends on this one, but I have to be true to what I see in the text when I look at these things.
And then we can flip it. We can give a positive example. Caleb and Othniel, not part of the elect.
Right.
They are outside that covenant community, yet I don't think there's any doubt that they had a true saving faith in God.
Right.
And, I don't know anyone who would say, well, Caleb's in hell. But
Sure.
he's not part of the elect. And this plays on into even greater themes, because in Deuteronomy 4:32 through 40, again, not going to read all of that, but if you want to, the references will be in the show notes. God talks about how he manifests in Egypt. In Egypt, in Exodus. And he says, has there ever been a God who has done? And he talks about, all the things that he did there.
Mm-hmm.
But verse 37 in particular, he says, and he loved your father and chose their offspring after them. So he very much did choose the nation of Israel. But I wanted to tie this back in, because when we talk about election, and we're talking with some inheritance and allotment language is going on in these passages. And so we're back to that Deuteronomy 32:8-9, that Israel is God's inheritance. Jacob is his portion. I probably flipped those. But so, we aren't arguing against election. That's there.
Right.
It is definitely 100% a part of the biblical worldview, and it always has been.
Yeah.
And we can't say, oh, well, that's Old Testament, so it doesn't matter anymore, because we're still talking about the same God.
Yeah.
Who still plays by the same rules. And Paul, when he's telling us, go back and read the scripture, he's not talking about the New Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I love that, there's that verse in Acts where the Bereans, and I may have mentioned it before, but it says the Bereans were more holy than the Thessalonians because they actually studied the scripture and understood what the scripture said. And what's the scripture there? It's the Old Testament. And again, Jesus explains to the people after his resurrection, he tells them, hey, this isn't something new. This has been the plan the whole time.
Exactly.
And so when we try to separate Old Testament from New Testament, we really, we're treading some dangerous water when we get into that, because we do get into, is it Marcionism, who believed there was a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament? Right. And so, yeah, and it really frustrates me whenever we start getting into that, oh, well, you're spending too much time in the Old Testament. Well, no, I'm actually not.
There's no such thing.
Yeah. And all scripture is God breathed and is useful for teaching and correcting. And, the list that Paul gives there, he wasn't talking about his own letters.
Right.
I don't think Paul understood the weight his letters were going to have as he was writing.
I think Paul had a huge ego personally. I see that in his writing, but I don't think it was that big.
No, yeah. No, I'm saying he definitely saw himself as authoritative to the churches he was writing to.
Right.
But I don't think he thought they would be, that his letters would be collected and translated and reprinted centuries after his death.
Right. Well, when I say that too, I should clarify. Paul had to have a certain amount of certainty and self-assurance to be able to say the things he did. I'm not faulting him for that. I think one of his battles was to keep it in check, and I think he does do that. But we see that, even with Deborah, when I arose, or even if Barak is singing that, but that idea that as a prophet, you have to be you have to kind of tiptoe to the edge of prideful. And so if you can't, then are you ever going to step out and make those proclamations? And that's difficult for us to kind of reconcile the personal tendencies with what God's doing. And so I don't, I'm not bashing Paul. Paul was obviously used of God, and he is part of our scripture, and everything he said is part of what we're supposed to be following, which we will be talking about Paul when we go back and do the wrap up on Judges and talk about women in leadership. So I'm not going to go there. But what you were saying, yes, we've got two different kinds of election, very prevalent in the Bible. We have election to service, where an individual or a nation, but usually an individual, God says, hey, you're going to do this, and you don't get out of it. Obviously, Jonah is a huge example of that. We do have that corporate election like you were talking about. It's interesting, John, the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 30, Jesus himself said, I chose you, I elected you, but one of you is a devil.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can't have election being synonymous with salvation.
Right. And and I find it interesting though, because, because God, I think in his choosing of Paul, I do think, and this is just pure speculation, I'm pulling this out of my guessing area.
I don't think it's the sin.
but people say that, Paul's conversion is evidence of the salvific election type of thing. And I think God was going to use Paul to further the gospel. Period.
Right.
Regardless of what Paul did.
Right.
And I do think Paul would have had a choice. I think his punishment would have been greater after seeing a vision like that. He could have, this is, again, speculation. I think he could have said no. And I think that his story would have been used to further the gospel either way. Because it already started before his conversion experience.
Precisely. Well, so let's take that back, because I think Paul had already made his choice. I think even before the vision, he had made his choice, and his choice was for God, because he studied. He was with the rabbis. He knew his Old Testament. He was trying to defend God. He was trying to.
Yeah. He was doing what he believed was right.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think he was. Yeah. I hadn't put that to it, but yeah.
I hadn't until you started talking.
But I definitely think that there could have been this moment to say, no, I don't believe Christ is Messiah. At which point he would have been stepping away from Yahweh.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that he had already demonstrated that his heart was so for Yahweh that when he was confronted with, this is the truth, this is where I'm really going to get to connect with him and find what I've been seeking, then he course corrected. And God moved, I think, in response to Paul's desire. And
I can see that. Yeah, that would make sense.
Well, I mean, you don't spend the time and the energy that Paul spent learning Torah if you don't love God.
Right.
You don't do it. But you brought up something too about how this corporate election and the plan that throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament, Ephesians 1 through 11, it's about the corporate election of the Gentiles into God's salvation plan, that he wants to bring them in, and that was predestined from the beginning of the earth. And when you read this idea of corporate election and election to service, and you have that playing in the background instead of meticulous determination or irresistible grace, then you have a whole different outcome, because you're coming into it with something different. And
you have a whole different relationship. Well, you actually have a relationship for one, but that's
right.
We can harp on that much later.
Well, and then, that's the thing. If you read it this way, then Ephesians 1's talking about the reversal of Babel. It's talking about the restoration of Eden. God always intended for Babel to be reversed. He always intended for Eden to be restored. And so it falls in line. And I think if we read the New Testament with the Old Testament in mind, and we don't start our reading in Matthew, now we have a much better basis to interpret the rest of the New Testament on.
Yeah. Well, and you see you see a microcosm of that. You see that at Pentecost, this idea of Babel being reversed when you hear people are hearing the gospel in their own language.
Yeah.
And the disciples are speaking in languages they don't know.
Right.
And you have that, like I said, it's kind of a microcosm of that ultimate reversal. I think it was God showing, no, this is the power, this is the goal, this is what we're working toward. So I love that. So
I was looking here because there is a passage in Hebrews 6, and it helps if I'm actually in Hebrews 6.
Oh, it won't be in this one.
No. Yeah.
That's the Jewish study Bible.
That one
have Hebrews there.
Yeah, that one stops with the Italian shoemaker prophet, Malici. It was a bad seminary joke. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah.
But
most of that's correct. Go ahead.
Okay, so Hebrews 6, we're going to start at verse 1. It says, "Therefore let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ, and go on to maturity, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and faith towards God, and of instruction about washing and laying on the hands and the resurrection of the dead for eternal judgment. This we will do if God permits, or is impossible in the case of those who have been once enlightened, to have tasted the heavenly gift and shared in the Holy Spirit, and have tasted the goodness of the Word of God and the power of the ages to come, and then to fall away to restore them again to repentance, since they are crucifying once again the Son of God to their own harm, and the holding him up to contempt. For the land drunk the rain that often falls on it, and produces crop useful to those for whose sake it is cultivated, and receives a blessing from God. But if it bears thorns and thistles, it's worthless, and near to being cursed, and its end is to be burned. Now,
So we've got to tie back to Genesis.
got your tie back to Genesis.
We've got our tie back to Deborah.
Got our tie back to Deborah.
Yeah, and that actually that 6:1. That's actually the verse a couple weeks ago that I couldn't remember.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the one I was trying to remember. So, but,
Well, and it's all very much with Deuteronomy language, tasting the heavenly gift. A Hebrew reader reads this, and they're thinking manna.
right
And to be enlightened was to stand at the foot of Sinai.
now, are they thinking manna, or are they thinking of Torah? Because well, I'm sure,
Yeah.
but yeah, because you talk about manna in the Torah. But because we do have the tradition of feeding honey to children when you teach Torah.
Mhm.
So you have this idea of, as you're learning, you're tasting sweetness
Right.
and tying sweetness to study and to the study of Torah specifically.
Right.
So that's kind of where my mind went when you're talking about tasting the heavenly gift.
Yeah.
But of course, then you also, if you look at the description of, I'm just rambling here, but you look at the description of manna, it talks about it tastes like wafers cooked with honey.
Right.
So, all of it ties together.
Right. And the thing is, if you get into these discussions about free will, predestination, the security of salvation, security of the believer, can you lose your salvation? All of these conversations that New Testament students and academics have, take this back and let your reading be informed by the Old Testament. Now it makes sense.
Mhm.
These questions begin to get answered, and I don't want to go into it a whole lot because I didn't take time to go, okay, here's how Hebrews 6 plays out in relationship to Deborah. But I wanted to throw this out there to show you how the shared language of these passages in the New Testament and the Old Testament help us understand.
Mhm.
And we don't have the same questions that so many people have when we stop to study the Old Testament. I can look at this and go, hey, I get the fact that we don't get to well, let me use a picture. This will be easier. The people at Sinai, when they were standing at the base of Sinai, they were enlightened. They had God revealed to them.
Mhm.
They didn't have a good excuse to fall away.
Right.
When you've had that kind of revelations, the earth shook, the thunder and the lightning, Moses coming down with his face glowing from having seen God.
Mhm.
This is the reason why they didn't get to enter the promised land, because they had seen all the miracles in Egypt as they came out. And to witness God's power that way and to still turn away and grumble, there's a problem. And this is what I believe the writer of Hebrew is comparing Christians to. It's like, don't be those people.
Mhm.
Don't be those people, because what's that going to mean to your salvation? And so we get this, when we get these pictures and we begin to fill them in with the story that God has given us, not our own speculation, now we get it a little better. And it like I said, it draws from that Deuteronomy language. And the Deuteronomy language actually probably draws on Deborah, the Song of Deborah, because Song of Deborah is older.
Mhm.
And both of them lay out this idea: you can choose. There's choices and there's consequences. You get to choose. And that's being one of the foundational pieces of Judaism. That's significant. So we were talking about that last week. How important was this to Judaism?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I believe it was very, very important. So now that we've gone off on that little tangent from a single line.
Yeah, that's
And
it's incredible.
And this is, like I said, Deborah is a prophet. So she's not just speaking on her own behalf, she's speaking on behalf of God. And her words are God's.
So, and what you're saying is we should take her seriously because we should take God seriously.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
In short.
Yeah.
Just shut the show down. To shut the show down, yeah, let's just cut it off there. We take God seriously.
Well,
our job is done.
Right. So, verse 9, we're going to pick up. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly. So we're still playing on that theme. Mm-hmm. You get to decide whether...
It's like the repeated hook.
Yeah. God didn't force them. And the other thing, there's no hesitation for them to obey a command of a woman. So that's interesting. So if you want to look at the gender issue, I think it's there. But again, more importantly, it's not about whether she's a woman or not. It's whether the people believe she spoke on behalf of God. Verses 10 and 11, she's commanding them to remember to tell the story. And she's talking to the nobles, the white donkey and the rich carpets there. These are people who had influence. They're well-to-do.
Okay. I kind of wondered about that because it's one of those idioms that doesn't translate
it doesn't
very well. I mean, especially when we're in a, quote, post-agrarian society. Right. I hate that term, and I've mentioned why, yeah.
Yeah, and so she's telling you, hey, if you're rich and you're doing well, you need to tell the story. The sung about this to be sung about by the musicians at the well, because the musicians at the well, these aren't just, we think of somebody on the street corner playing a guitar. No, this is where you learned your history.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's where everyone had to go to the well,
right?
It's the meeting place,
exactly. And so you're being taught. And I was thinking about this the other day. We've talked about I say we, the collective we, how memories are not really good anymore because we have access to these things to prompt our memory.
Yeah, it's the helper brain,
right? Well,
I mean, that's I'm gonna my joke is they were talking about there was speculation that like the Brontosaurus had like a helper brain in it by its hips. That's that's what we have. We just have them in our pocket. It's right there.
I hadn't thought about
our
that.
Helper brain.
Well, but the thing where I was going with that, I don't know if it's necessarily because we have a helper brain, which actually works here, or if it's because there were 5 songs this old.
Mm-hmm.
If you only have 5 songs, I mean, I'm sure there were more, but if you have 5 primary songs, mm-hmm. everybody's going to know those.
Yeah.
And so it's not, I think sometimes just not being overwhelmed by the information. And so if you have, a handful of songs are being sung over and over again, now everyone's going to know it. You can go any place and you're going to sing along.
Yeah. Which actually kind of fits with this idea. Okay. So, there's this idea with social media and internet news and just information being able to get out there so fast. There's speculation, of course, again, we're going to talk about Nazis and Hitler and stuff, which I hate even bringing that stuff up because it feels like it's an overused analogy. But, with book burnings
mm-hmm.
And censorship, removing information, there's this train of thought, which I think is actually pretty accurate, that we don't have to do that anymore because it is so much information is flooding over us,
right?
That we don't have time to process most of it in any kind of significant way.
I agree.
And so there's actually, and this is when you said that, when you've got 5 songs that, or a short list of songs that you can ponder deeply. Well, that's the thing, like right now, and I mean, you look at the Christian music market, and I hadn't planned on going here, but, we're talking about a song. We might as well talk about music. But the, just this, there's so many new songs coming out, and I know, people are going to be mad at me, but they all sound exactly the same, or so many of them do, that that they all just blend together, and you're
mm-hmm.
not actually contemplating the words. And I think I've mentioned this before on the show, but these songs were to teach,
right?
And anymore, the Christian music market is about creating an ethereal atmosphere. It's,
right.
It might as well be like the sitar music you play when you go to do yoga.
Right.
I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but that's where it is. It's mood music, so you can do your Christian yoga better. It's not for you to contemplate and to study. And that's my little soapbox spiel. But I get very, very frustrated by just it's just constantly, there's something new every week. There's a new song and it sounds just like the old song.
Right.
And you can mix and match choruses together. So it's not a memory tool at all.
Right.
And, so much so that I heard a song the other day. I was filling in for Dave Dolphin up at Cherokee Hills for any of the worship leader group. And there was a song, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it. His last name's Dummer, like I think it's Dummer.
Okay.
Is his last name. And this song, and I heard it and I was like, this song actually, it stands out musically for one from all the rest of them. The way it starts, the way it builds, the chorus is complementary to the verses and vice versa. And I was like, this song, I loved it. And I, so much so that I was like, just blown away. I was shocked. I mean,
and this never happens, folks.
This is not to put down anyone. Yeah, this is not to put down like the typical song selection that I hear from Dave specifically, but he does do a lot of popular stuff. But when I heard that one, I was just I was blown away. So I'll look. Elias Dummer, I think, is the guy's name, and the song is Enough. We'll put it in the show notes, but yeah, definitely check it out. It's really, really good because it's written poetically. It's not hokey. I mean,
right.
Think about how many times you hear the word Jesus in a song and it almost immediately sounds hokey. Like there's just something about the way a lot of Christian writing goes. And again,
the boyfriend song.
I'm harping on this, and I'm sorry for going too long, but he does it, and it doesn't sound one bit hokey through the whole song. It's amazing. So yeah, I'll play it for you after we're done recording.
I figured you would because, like I said, this never happens.
Yeah, Emily's like, she's probably still processing. Like,
I
what?
was waiting. I'm like, okay, who's he going to say something negative against him? How much hate mail are we going to get? Oh, God, please make him be quiet. So I was glad when...
No, it's positive. Elias Dummer, and we should see about getting him on the show. It'd be great.
Okay, yeah, because I'm like breathing a sigh of relief. It's positive. So anyway, but there is something to that, because if you realize that for a long period of time, they as a nation would have just had the Torah as far as book wise, and you would read these passages and you would mull them over and you would study them and you would reread them and you would study them. And this is why the rabbis had all of these various connections and stuff, because they weren't reading BuzzFeed listicles.
Right.
They weren't taking up brain space with that. And I'm not bashing anyone who does. I sometimes read them because they're hilarious, but
sure, sometimes
they were a waste of my time. But,
But they were cross-referencing this stuff for years.
Precise.
And cataloging it.
Oh, it was always in the back of their heads, just brewing. And it's amazing what happens if you take the Bible and you really do meditate on it like we're supposed to. I have story after story, but we're not going to go there. This passage here, verses 10 and 11, it's also connected back to Deuteronomy 6:7, which Deuteronomy 6 is where we find the Shema. And so, because you're supposed to teach it as you walk along the road. Deborah's saying, my words that are happening here that I'm saying are just as important as the law given in Deuteronomy. I want you to put them maybe not as high as the Shema, but you need to put them pretty close. And so she's making a lot of statements about what she's saying as far as the significance of the song.
Yeah.
And I think we overlook that. So verse 12, we think that this is where one of the choir parts, this is kind of more traditionally one of the few places where it's agreed upon that the choir responds to them. Verse 13, definitely this is where Barak picks up, and he sings this as celebration. He does not sound like a man humiliated here.
Right. Yeah, I think you touched on that when we talked about it. The first verse, it says, "And they sang together."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, he's singing this song, and I just want to pick out one little word here. At the end of the verse, it says, "And the people of the Lord marched down for me against the mighty." Now, that word there is Gibborim,
Mm-hmm.
which,
If 13.
yeah, we're in verse 13. The word Gibborim, when we first encounter it, that's Genesis 6. That's when the sons of God took the daughters of men and they had the children,
Mm-hmm.
and the children were the mighty men of old, men of renown.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a quick note here. When we talk about Gibborim, we aren't always talking about the Nephilim,
Right.
but I believe this was intentional because we're getting ready to move into that supernatural aspect.
Yeah. Well, and one thing here, I would say I really like the wording of the JPS on this.
Give it to us.
It is the Lord's people won my victory over the warriors.
So okay, so
I love that. That it because it's it comes across as a little more humble than the way the ESV
Right.
renders it. That it was the people, God's people, fighting, and he wasn't just taking all the credit. So
Right.
I like that.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes the JPS is really good about bringing it kind of back down to earth and taking it out of the abstract. Where
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed the wording of the JPS because it, like you said, it's more earthy.
Yeah.
Kind of feel.
Yeah, which is kind of funny that we like that because we're getting ready to go
into. Yeah, I realized what I said after I said it.
But no, this Gibborim, the use of this word sets us up for where she's taking us. And now, as we're reading through this, and I know I keep saying this is prophecy. So prophecy isn't really concerned about what happens in the world so much as it is, or when I say that, it's not worried about preserving facts. It's not worried about retelling history. Its job is not to give you a catalog of things that happened. It's about revealing spiritual truths. And so when we have the use of this word Gibborim, and any Hebrew person would have immediately been thinking of that Genesis 6 account because it's so huge and so central to ancient Judaism's theology, you can't escape it.
Right.
So she's setting us up. Now, verse 14 through 18, there's a list of tribes. We talked about how that was takes us back to Deuteronomy 33 and Genesis 49. I'm not going to go into it, but basically she's praising the tribes that helped and she's chastising the tribes that didn't. And she's explaining to you what everyone did right and what everyone did wrong. There's only one verse I really want to look at, and that is verse 14, because if you'll read it in the, do you have your ESV there?
I got ESV. Do you want that one?
Yeah, read the ESV and then read the JPS.
Okay. From Ephraim, sorry, hold on. Again, the reading aloud thing from last week. From Ephraim, their route, they marched down into the valley.
Okay, yeah, stop right there. Now read the JPS.
Well, let me switch over here. Verse 14. From Ephraim they came down, they whose root are in Amalek. After you, your kin Benjamin.
Okay, we can stop there. But yeah, from the valley or from Amalek. And which one's right?
Remind us of Amalek. What is that?
Amalek, these are the descendants of Amalek. They're mentioned among the nation of giants in Numbers 13:25 through 33.
Gotcha.
So the Gibborim, like I said, setting us up.
Well, and actually, that actually makes sense. I had noticed that before because we do hear a lot about there were giants in the land, with numbers and the spies and all that. But we don't hear much about that unless you're looking at words like this.
Right.
You don't. The only thing you hear about is the Philistines and Goliath.
Yeah.
And so
no, they're still there.
Yeah. So
yeah.
So you have to be looking for them. You have to understand the language to know what you're looking at.
Yes. And what's funny is the this verse is controversial because their root is in Amalek. The Ephraim, this is what's going on here. And it seems like when we get these two different passages, the word for Amalek is kept as Amalek. If we're going off the Hebrew passages, if we work from a Septuagint translation, the Septuagint translators change this to valley. So
Okay.
whose roots in the valley, because they didn't like the idea of Ephraim being rooted in Amalek.
Well,
Well, the easiest explanation for this, Ephraim lived in the land that had belonged to the Amalekites.
that was exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
would be the easiest way to say that. Yeah, they happen to live where the Amalekites lived.
Yeah, and it's not, it's not a hard thing to figure out, because in Judges 12:15 it says specifically that Ephraim's living in the hill country that belonged to the Amalekites. So we don't have to have some convoluted explanation. Now, I was kind of I was disappointed that the ESV didn't preserve the Amalek, that it actually went with the Valley's translation,
Mhm.
because I think this is important and significant, particularly as we move forward, that this is a divine revelation. This is a look into the supernatural world.
Mhm.
So when you've got the Gibborim, you've got the Amalekites being mentioned. And then verse 19, and the kings came, they fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils for their silver. So the verse 19 on that, the kings, we aren't referring to kings of Israel. There's no kings of Israel. We're talking about kings of Canaan fighting. And again, kings are representatives of these divine powers. And so they're fighting, and we're starting to get a glimpse that this is going to be a cosmic battle, because Deborah set us up. She did it so well.
Mhm.
We're going to talk about the Gibborim. We're going to talk about Amalek.
Yeah, well, and then when we move into verse 20, I mean, then you're really definitely there. The stars fought from heaven. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses, they fought against Sisera.
Yeah.
I mean, and when we talk about star language, we're talking about divine beings,
Precisely.
either angelic or other. What do you want to call it? Little lesser gods?
The lesser Elohim,
Yeah.
the godlets. Yeah. Now, I do want to, before we get into that, because I do have several verses to set that up for people who might not understand or, see how deeply that idea of stars and angels and the lesser Elohim is rooted in the Bible. Because I know a lot of people hear, oh, Megiddo, and they want to go, we're
straight into the old, straight into Revelation, right?
Yeah. And okay, so just not to go too far afield, the Valley of Megiddo is not Armageddon. In Revelation, where it talks about Armageddon, John makes a little notation there that this is Harmageddon. It's not Armageddon. It's got an H in front of it. We don't have it in the English, but we do have it preserved in the Greek, because in the Greek, it's just a little breathing mark. So Har is mountain. Megeddon, you got the N sound at the end, not Megiddo.
Right.
So yeah, we have some letters in and they're similar, but they're two different things. And actually, the mountain of Megeddon is Jerusalem. So when we talk about Armageddon, we're not talking about a war being fought in a valley. We're talking about a war being fought on the mountain, the holy mountain.
Okay.
So,
and when you're talking about a war being fought on the holy mountain, typically we're talking about spiritual forces.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so I wanted to point that out, because I don't want us to get too far afield. So, but verse 20 through 21. Oh, by the way, if you want more on that, because I know that some people's minds just melted and they're like, whoa, give us more. That was a straight rip from Dr. Michael Heiser. It's in the
Is that reversing Hermann?
No, that's Unseen Realm. There's an entire section just on that, and he breaks down all the linguistics. And but if you want to go deeper, you can. But basically, that's the simple version.
Fair enough.
So so verse 20 through 21. Yes, definitely, we're getting into star language. From the heavens, the stars fought. From their courses, they fought against Sisera, and the torrents of Kashan swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kashan, march on my soul with might. Again, real quick, that might, Gibborim.
Okay. Now talk about, do you have anything on this ancient torrent?
No, and that was kind of everywhere I looked. I was having a hard time finding it. Now, what is interesting, the fact that it's called an ancient torrent. I guess I do. I don't have it in my notes. Okay, so the fact that I got stuff tucked away up
but
here.
I don't. But...
So the Kishon is typically not a mighty river. Like I said, you can usually just step across it in a few steps. It's just a small stream. And so the rabbinic writers said that God had actually stored up waters of Kishon and had held them back specifically from the beginning of time for this day.
Okay.
So the torrent was ancient in the fact that it had been pre-planned.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. And what's funny is as you were going through that, I was actually piecing it together, like partly that way is like, as in this is a place where, I'm kind of, again, speculation. I'm kind of thinking of this as like the ancient torrent, like as it was stored up, or if there was this place where maybe there was like this river that flows in the unseen realm, and then God moves it over to, to the physical for the purpose of this battle. And again, I'm speculating. And it's crazy, and it sounds weirder the more I say it out loud.
Setting up, you're setting up things in my brain, because okay, I'm looking at.
But no, that would make sense to say that maybe this to say, because I mean, if you think of something that's ancient, or you think it's something that's dried out, something that's old. So if you have like this river valley that flash floods every so often, and then you have God's carved out this ancient river, but he's taken it away. He's storing it, waiting for this time. Yeah, it just...
Okay, it's not so crazy. And the reason why I'm saying it's not so crazy, so go back to Genesis 6, which we already have this connection that we've been building. Verse 11.
No. I think I see where you're going.
In the 600th year in Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the deep, great deep, burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were open. So there's this idea that's very much a part of the flood theology that God had stored up, all of this rain and had kept the waters back for this specific purpose and time.
Sure.
And I think there's even some more poetic references, which, this is on the fly, so I don't have time to really sit down and do all my digging that I want to. But I think there's something to that, because Sisera and his army, they weren't expecting this. And it was this great deluge that came in and just swept them away.
Right.
And this is what allowed Barak and his men to come in afterwards and just kind of do a cleanup mission.
Okay. So now we have a reference back to Egypt. Now we have a reference back to the flood.
Yeah.
What was the flood about? Apparently it was about the Nephilim.
And now we got the stars who are fighting. And so for those, I want to kind of build the case for that just a little bit, because Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20 says, "And beware lest you raise your eyes to the heaven. When you see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, you will be drawn away, bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord has allotted to all the peoples under the earth, all the peoples under the whole heaven." Sorry. "But when the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of its own, his inheritance, as you are this day." So we've got that connection to what he's saying here is the things in heaven. Yes, he created them. He created them for signs and seasons. Genesis tells us that they're going to be markers in the sky. But he's saying, don't worship them. This host of heaven language. Don't get lost in anything out there that I may not have listed specifically. They're yes, I talked about the sun and the moon and the stars, but anything beyond just what you see with your eye, that you need to be aware that you should not worship them, because they're not your gods. I gave those gods to other nations. He did that in Babel. Israel and Jacob, they're his. So, and this matches, like I said, matches up with that 32:8 and 9 in Deuteronomy, that worldview that was very much present there, that allotment language. 2 Kings, we have people worshiping the host of heaven, the host of heaven being foreign gods. That's 2 Kings 17 and 16, 2 Kings 21 and 35, 3 through 5, sorry, 2 Kings 3 through 5, Nehemiah 9:6, the host of heaven worships God.
Right.
So in Job, the morning stars sing together. And so once again, we're back to the angel idea.
Mm-hmm.
And
which is, and the morning stars sing together. That is not a reference to the fact that stars emit frequencies that can be transcribed into music. Yes, they do vibrate, and if they had an atmosphere, you would probably be able to hear some kind of noise from them, but it's not a science reference.
Yeah.
So anyway, when we cover that in episode 1, I know exactly where to find that one. So if you want to hear more about that, episode 1, go check it out.
Yeah. So stars, host of heaven, these are used interchangeably with that lesser Elohim, spiritual beings. And when we say lesser Elohim, we're not saying there's other gods in competition with the God.
Right.
We're saying that anything spiritual.
Yeah. And the Bible's clear about that. There is only one like Yahweh.
Right.
So
Yahweh is an Elohim, but not all Elohim are Yahweh. So it's a distinction. I think probably the most familiar reference of angels being equated with stars is Isaiah 14:12 through 13, where Satan himself is described as a star, and the stars being equated with the host of heaven, the sons of God. This sets the scene for what Deborah is talking about. I mean, she's saying there's something supernatural going on here. Be aware. It wasn't because Barak won this victory. It's because God and the angels were fighting for our nation. Mm-hmm. And I think she even gets more specific than just fighting for the nation, but we're going to get to that.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, yeah, that's some crazy stuff. So how we're kind of coming up on time.
Okay, so
let's kind of find a spot to wrap up.
Okay, so how many minutes do I have?
-3.
-3. Okay. So I'm just going to throw out a bunch right quick because we know that angels fight. Joshua 5, Numbers 22, Daniel 10. Michael fights the prince of Persia. Mm-hmm. Jude and Deuteronomy 10 both describe God as coming with his armies of 10,000 holy ones. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, Revelation 12, and there was a war in heaven, and Michael fights the red dragon. Mm-hmm. So what Deborah's saying here is not something we should expect it. We should expect it. And this is also very common in other ancient cultures. I have a part written out here. I'm not going to read all of it, but this is a stela from Egypt. Mm-hmm. And we talked about this. This is part of the Egyptian folklore, and this is part of the myth about Amun-Ra. And it says, it was in a second hour, a star came from the south of them. Never had the like occur. It flashed against them. They're talking about guards here. Not one withstood before it with the fire on their faces. No one among them found his hand nor looked back. And their chariotry and their horses were no more. So the idea of stars fight wasn't just a Jewish concept. It was it was across this whole part.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about the covenant of symbols, that whenever you're composing poetry, literature, anything like that, you use things that your audience is going to be familiar with.
Correct.
You use a symbol they know. And so this, right here you are. Where's Israel? They're right in the middle of
all
everything.
Of this.
So they're in the middle of a place that uses all this imagery. So of course, yeah, you would use it in your poetry.
And there's actually even more to this, but we're going to save it for the next episode. I just want to establish the stars are angels in this verse, and they are fighting on the behalf of Israel. So
yeah, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Seriously, angels fighting on your behalf.
Yeah,
I think
I kind of have this image of Lord of the Rings when they're in the river, and she calls the river to take out the enemies,
and especially with the torrents of Kishon coming down.
Yeah, no, it's just wild stuff. So yeah, I'm looking forward to next week. I think it's gonna be fun. So sorry to cut it short. I feel like that's kind of an awkward place to pause, but I don't want to get us too long into things.
We get to pick it up in 5 minutes anyway. So
well, for us, but for everyone out there, it's gonna be next week. But everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Just bear with us. We're having a good time. If you want to be part of the conversation, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those places. I'm terrible with stuff I'm supposed to have memorized. Hit us up there. Raven Creek SC, that's our handle on all of those. RavenCreekSC.com gets you to our website. We got some other shows. We got not Visual Companions. We got show notes. That's another podcast. It's not even ours. But anyway, we got show notes there. We've got other blog companion pieces, and we've got a couple other shows. Go check them out. And also, there is a link on there that says support us. We would love it if anyone out there cares to send us a couple bucks every month to help us eventually upgrade equipment and also keep our hosting fees paid up so we can keep doing this.
Precisely.
So we are having a great time, and we hope to see you back next week. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.